Yeah, democracy is because the Greeks are interested in this. And it's often felt, I think. I mean, democracy is a big hurrah word in modern politics, and it's often felt that had it not been for these battles that were fought between the Greeks and the Persians with Greek success, that democracy might not have happened, or it might not have happened in the way it did. And it was a remarkable thing in the ancient world, I think, to give. I mean, it wasn't, like we think of democracy now in a very different way. I mean, their democracy was, by our standards, not very democratic because it was ruled by the citizens who were adult, male, native, and free. So it's a slave-owning society. Women don't have the vote. Neither do children, neither do resident aliens, and so on. So in that respect, it's not very democratic by our standards. But by their standards, our democracies are really not that democratic either, because we don't have the same kind of level of input that they did.
Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.
Namaste. I, Mithilesh and Sumit, welcome you all to a new episode of the Eastern Report. Today, we have noted historian Dr. Stephen Kershaw on our show. Today, we'll discuss Stephen Kershaw's book, 3 Epic Battles That Shaped Democracy, Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me onto your program. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
More than 2,500 years since the Persian King Xerxes was defeated following his invasion of Greece, these ancient battles still resonances in modern history and have left us tales of heroic resistance in the face of seemingly hopeless odds. In 3 epic battles that shaped democracy, Dr. Stephen Kershaw focuses on both sides of 3 historic battles, Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis, between the Greeks led by democratic Athens and militaristic Sparta, and the Persian Empire ruled by powerful kings, without which the history of Europe and the West would have been radically different. Dr. Stephen Kershaw has been a classic tutor for some 30 years, teaching at all levels from beginner to PhD, currently operating out of the Oxford University Department of Continuing Education, authoring and teaching undergraduate courses and tutoring on the Masters in Literature and Arts. So, Stephen, what made you write a book on the 3 epic battles, Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis?
Well, I've been interested in the Greek and the Persian history and their interaction for quite some time. I've been writing about other things, about a recent publication about barbarians, which the ancient Greeks regarded the Persians as barbarians in a sort of linguistic and cultural sense. I mean, that's not to say that the Persians were in any way barbarous or barbaric, and so on. But I was interested in these interactions between the cultures and how different cultures see each other. And the other thing was that there was also a big anniversary coming up as well, with the 2,500th anniversaries of the battles of Thermopylae and Salamis coming up, and there was an interest in that in Greece and elsewhere. So it seemed appropriate, I think, to revisit and to explore these essentially hugely important conflicts, and to perhaps to reappraise them in the light of new discoveries, some new ways of looking at the battles and so on. So it seemed topical, appropriate, and interesting as well.
Yeah. So coming back to challenges in writing the book. So what challenges did you face?
Yes, as a historian, you encounter many challenges, and the prime one, I think, is with our evidence. Is that we will always seek evidence, and much of the evidence that we have from the ancient world is incomplete. It's not created at the time. But in the case of these wars, we have the writings of one of the great historians, perhaps the first great historian, Herodotus, who was able to speak to people who'd been involved in these and to present his vision, his research about this, which covers not just the, if you like, the fighting and what happens on the battlefield, because in the context of his history, there's very little of that. But he's also interested in the geography, in the ethnography of these people, and the mythology. So he's interested in not just what happened, but why it happened, what the people were like, what were the causes of this conflict, what were the various combatants like, and how did these events play out. So he presents us with wonderful opportunities, but great challenges. Also, in the mix, coming from the Greek side, and I have to say that the bulk of our evidence side, rather than from the Persian, but we also have the work of a tragic playwright, Aeschylus, who, in all probability, fought in the Battle of Marathon, whose brother was killed at that battle, and who also wrote a magnificent tragedy about the Battle of Salamis, where he presents, if you like, a Persian version of that. He sets his play at the Persian court and explores the responses of the Persian, particularly the Persian King Xerxes, but his family and his entourage in the light of the events that have taken place in Greece. That's fascinating, I think, because his balance of that is really interesting. It's not, if you like, a jingoistic piece of Greek glorification, but a very moving piece about the effects that the war has, particularly on the Persian side. We also have inscriptions, which are wonderful because they're very much first-hand documents, almost produced at the time, giving us memorials, sometimes lists of people who were involved in the fighting. But those are very fragmentary, tantalizing in many ways, but we have those. So, coming from the Greek side, there's a deeply embedded tradition. From the Persian side, it's more challenging because the Persians are, again, a very eloquent, sophisticated um, people whose kings produce amazing monuments with multilingual inscriptions talking about their achievements and what have you. But on the Persian side, there is almost nothing. There's almost like a complete silence. So getting uh, trying to unravel that is equally exciting and difficult in a sense. Is it because they thought that these events were really not that important in a way that the Greek world thought they were perhaps the most important thing ever, or is it that there was, that they felt that they'd been unsuccessful? It may have been the case, but if they were seeking to make propaganda out of it, they could easily have spun it as a victory, because in some ways anyway, Xerxes had achieved the goals he set out to achieve, and done what his father Darius had sort of half completed. So in all of this is the ancient historian's world, if you like, to try to unpack incomplete stories, to get behind the stories, to get into the biases, to fill in the gaps. It's fascinating, interesting challenges, I think.
Yeah, so I would like to show this wonderful book that recently came into publication. So it has everything one would like to know about the ancient Greek history, about the three epic battles. So I would urge my audience to go and pick this book. It has everything one need. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much. That's very kind of you.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. You talk about all the challenges that you had faced while writing the book. But I mean, I find it very interesting that you use the word democracy in your book. Why the usage of the word democracy?
Yeah, democracy is because the Greeks are interested in this. And it's often felt, I think, rightly or wrongly. I mean, I discussed this a little bit in the book as well. Is um, that the I mean, democracy is a big hurrah word in modern politics, I think, and it's often felt that had it not been for these um, battles that were fought between the Greeks and the Persians with Greek success, that democracy might not have happened, or it might not have happened in the way it did. The context of all this, I think, is very interesting. Is that the Athenians had only just really within a couple of generations developed their democratic constitution. But I mean, it didn't just come overnight. This had been developed over 100 years or so. But to them it was new and it was fragile. It was in its infant state, and and it was a remarkable thing in the ancient world, I think, to give. I mean, it wasn't, like we think of democracy now in a very different way. I mean, their democracy was, by our standards, not very democratic, because it was a rule by the citizens who were adult, male, native, and free. So it's a slave-owning society. Women don't have the vote. Neither do children. Neither do resident aliens, and so on. So in that respect, it's not very democratic by our standards. But by their standards, our democracies are really not that democratic either, because we don't have the same kind of level of input that they did. So it was just interesting, I think, is in that, and one of the big focuses of the ancient accounts is on this, is that one of the reasons that the Greek historians feel that they win is that they have something to fight for. And what they're fighting for is their land and their way of life and their families and so on. But also this freedom, this that they feel that they have, this democratic freedom to exercise their power over their own government. And they are pitted in this as Democrats against a monarchy, against a king who is powerful, who is all powerful. And there's an interesting moment actually in the when Darius the first becomes king. There's a debate among his entourage about where they should go. Should we? And one of the guys says, I think I'm in favour of democracy here. I think it's a good idea on the Athenian model. I think this is a good idea. One of the other guys says, no, I don't like that. As far as I'm concerned, democracy means mob rule. It's a mess. It's a great chaotic horror. I think it should be a small oligarchy of just a few of us. The best men should be ruling. This doesn't have that mob rule state, all the best people in command. And Darius says, no, I don't like that either, because eventually, what will happen is this oligarchy will lead to mob rule and democracy. So it's generally a bad idea. I think that just the best person should be in command. I'm the best person. I should be in command. And they all say, oh, yes, you are the best person. You should be. So we have this interesting, if you like, ideological clash within the work, where democracy is seen to be at stake. It's something on the Greek side that is worth fighting for. That they're so vested in their own way of life and their involvement in it that it makes them fight like crazy. And that is certainly one of the ways that it's put across. Even Herodotus says that this power of democratic freedom is what makes the Greeks fight so effectively and essentially win their conflicts.
Would you say that the ideological differences between this democracy versus this autocratic one monarchy rule could be one of the reasons why there was this always a long-lasting future concept between the two civilizations? How much of a role did it actually play? Obviously, empire building and expansion must have played a huge role, but how much of these ideological differences played it out in that context? I mean, if you also look at in the modern context, for instance, the Cold War itself was a large part of it was very ideological differences between the capitalistic versus socialistic uh, viewpoint of the world. So similarly, do you think that differences in the viewpoint played a huge role?
Yeah, I think it does to an extent. I think it's almost like it plays more of a role on the Greek side than it does on the Persians. I mean, the Persians are not really what it's often said that had the Persians won, then democracy would never have survived. But they didn't go to Greece in order to eradicate democracy. I think essentially in the Persian Empire, they were broadly speaking tolerant of other forms of government as long as they didn't cause them a nuisance. So, and I think this is partly the reason that the conflict arose in the first place, is that there were a number of Greek cities in Ionia, which is now it's the western coast of modern Turkey. Well, and there were these powerful and thriving Greek cities that were under Persian control. But the Persians were installing puppet governments there, people that the Greeks called tyrants, who weren't necessarily tyrannical in that sense, but they were puppets of the Persians. And this was at a time when other Greek states like Athens were developing democratic constitutions, and they would like to be that. And also there was other things in the way that the Persians were governing them that they didn't like. So they were seeking to, if you like, to eject their tyrannical or their tyrant governors. And that meant, of course, because they were supported by Persians, they had to rebel against Persia. So, if you like, on the Greek side of things, there is an ideological, perhaps more of an ideological element to it. On the Persian side, one of the things that they want is that when the Greeks rebel against them, they perceive that as an act of unprovoked aggression. So there's a revenge motive comes in, is that they want revenge particularly for one incident, is that in that rebellion the Greeks burned, actually by accident it seems, the regional capital of Sardis, and in that conflagration a temple was destroyed, a really important temple, and so the destruction of the temple and the destruction of the city became a real issue for King Darius, who wanted revenge for this, to take it on. So that I think that's part of it. Your point about expansionism as well is true. The Persian Empire was expansionist. It was, and before he invaded Greece, Darius had invaded Scythia, not that successfully, but he was seeking to do it. And we also have a lovely story. This is one of those things where you think, well, is this true, and how on earth does Herodotus find this out? But there's a wonderful scene where King Darius is in bed with his wife, Atossa, and she says, look, you're newly king of Persia, you're a fine young man, you need to prove that you're a man. And I've heard all about these wonderful women in Greece, from Corinth and Athens and Sparta. I want some of them as slaves. So I want you to conquer Greece. And this is before the rebellion. So I think that there's elements here of Yeah, in a sense, the Persian Empire is expansionist by default. If you are, king of the Persian Empire, you need, in Aristotle's word, you need to prove that you are a real man, and do that. So I think it works both ways. So I think when the Persians invade Greece, they are really wanting expansionism. Maybe that's cool if we can get that, but revenge. On the Greek side, it's more of an ideological thing. We're fighting for our democracy, our freedom of speech, our freedom under the law, and what have you. So it's interesting. I don't think it's necessarily. It's not. It's perhaps not like the Cold War in a sense in that way.
How much of this fragmentation of the Greek society because of this voiced opinion, which was a component of the democracy itself, led to they having challenges against this Persian invasion?
Yeah, this is interesting as well because the Greek world was by no means unified. Anyway, we often talk of the Greeks, but they weren't unified on a macro level because they live in a large number of quite small, fiercely independent states. The word for it is polis, and these independent states are the geography of Greece has a big deal to play here because it's a mountainous place and lots of places are isolated from one another. So their self-sufficiency, their independence, their internal unity is something that's very important to them. So unifying as a nation, if you like, in the face of the Persian invasion is really, really difficult for them. Because there's this idea as well that my enemy's enemy is my friend. So there's lots of people. A lot of them are quite happy to welcome in the Persians because it might suit their own agenda. If the Persians are coming against the Athenians, and I don't like the Athenians, well, I'm with the Persians, So and the number of Greek states who came together in the resistance was relatively small. The great monument that they erected at the end of the conflict, there were only 31 states named on that out of well over 100. And even some of those kind of sneaked their names on at the end because they probably shouldn't have been there. So there's if you like, difficulties of macro unity. But even within the states themselves, the and within the, if you like, the resistance, they're trying to get a unified policy is very difficult. The Athenians want to fight in certain places. The Spartans, who have a very different kind of government model to them anyway, want to fight somewhere else. So trying to get everyone to get in the same place and fight in the same place is really hard. And then also within these democratic states or what have you, even then it's not necessarily unified. There are conflicts within, if you like, micro conflicts within the states because not everybody, even in a democratic state, likes the democracy. There are aristocrats who do not like the rule of the people. They feel that people should not rule themselves. They should be ruled by us aristocrats, and so they're quite happy to look to external forces to support them as well. So, for instance, when as part of their move towards democracy, the Athenians had expelled their own tyrants. And the expelled tyrant Hippias had gone to Persia, taken refuge in Persia. So when Darius's forces came to attack Athens, who was with them? Well, Hippias was, because he was happy to advise the Persians and he wanted to be installed as the governor of Athens, when he hoped the Persians had won. So you have from the Greek perspective, finding unity and unity of purpose is very difficult. I mean, even on the battlefield, there is a moment in the final battle at Plataea when there is almost like a coup takes place at Athens, and it has to be stamped on because some of the aristocrats feel that they can exploit this to their own ends. So it's a fascinating element. These conflicts are often portrayed as fantastic achievements of Greek unity, and when it's actually nothing of the sort. It's remarkable that even that few of them were so unified. I think really interesting point.
Persia was the most powerful empire in the first millennium BC. What led their rise and the fall?
The rise and fall of Persia. He's talking about the Persians, yeah.
Yep.
So yeah, the Persian Empire happens slowly and incrementally. Over a long period of time, really. And again, as historians and archaeologists, we're struggling to find the real origins of this. But generally speaking, we have this build-up of, if you like, Persian power between two cultures. I think mainly there's the Persians and the Medes. The Greeks confuse the two. They find it difficult to, and they often call the invading army the Medes. But they just incrementally, gradually, they build their power. And they have to overcome the Assyrians and the Babylonians and so on. So it's a step by step, and then the Lydians as well, and that's where it really starts to impact with Greece. I think is that you get the Lydian Empire, ruled as it is by Croesus, controls all of those Greek cities in what is now Turkey. And Croesus is lured by misinterpreting an oracle, very famously, that says that if you attack the Persians, you will destroy a great empire. And he does attack the Persians of their great king Cyrus, and loses. And does destroy a great empire, but it's his own. And and that is what ultimately brings the Persians into. So the Persians take over the Lydian cities of the Asia Minor coast, and it becomes part of the Persian Empire. So the Persian Empire has gradually moved itself from the way eastern parts of what's now Iran to the Aegean Sea, to the Mediterranean Sea, and that takes a long time. And it is a flourishing, as I say, sophisticated, powerful empire. It's rich. It governs many peoples, and it has very effective systems of government. We have wonderful sort of archives of tablets talking about people traveling on the royal roads, what they're doing, what they're taking, how they're trading, how they're traveling, what they're trading. Wonderful stuff. We have really great insights into that. So it is powerful, sophisticated, and a lot of the time very well governed, I think. The fall of the Persian Empire, I guess this particular one is beyond the scope of the book, but it's finally rolled over in the end when Alexander the Great comes on the scene, and interestingly, I think that Alexander uses these conflicts as his justification for his invasion of Persia in the 4th century BC, so about 100 years later. And he and explicitly says, I'm now attacking you, Darius III, because your ancestors attacked Greece. So, and of course, Alexander is spectacularly successful in that, in creating his own, albeit very short-lived, empire himself. But that's just broadly the process, I think.
And what we generally see in history, that fragmentation and then consolidation, happens in a cycle. You have this great empires built, and then they get fragmented. Small empires emerge, and then again there is someone who comes along, and then that person conquers the entire region. So, obviously, I think Alexander, you talked about, he kind of combined all the small city states, and obviously went on to win other parts of the world. So, would you say that this constant infighting between all these city states might have led to the rise of this kings like Alexander? That also happened in Greece.
Yeah, I think so, because I think what you find is that prior to the Persian invasion, the Greek city-states are fighting amongst each other. One of the things I find really interesting, actually, is that one of the crucial moments in this whole conflict is when the Athenians decide they're going to build a navy. And they have some ships, but they then strike a rich vein of silver in their mining district. And there's this decision that has to be made. What are we going to do with this money? And it's Themistocles who drives them to construct a fleet of state-of-the-art warships. It's interesting that what he doesn't say, because you're going to need these against the Persians. He says you're going to need these against the island of Aegina, who is a long-standing enemy. It's another Greek island. The two, you can see Aegina from Athens, and they've been rivals. They hate each other. So I think these fragmentations are always going on, and I say the Greeks come together to an extent. Aegina and Athens fight side by side in the end, but after the war, again, it's almost like, oh, we've got rid of the Persians, now we can go back to fighting ourselves again. And that's in a sense what they do. That the next phase of Greek history is essentially the Peloponnesian War. But that after the war, Athens has become militarily powerful, particularly on sea, and is starting to challenge the Spartan military supremacy, which is mainly land-based. And then we have a subsequent conflict that comes through, which Thucydides, who fought in that conflict, another great historian, says is due to Athens's rising power and Sparta's fear of it. So they're constantly in that sort of fragmented state. And yes, in the end, I think when Alexander's father, particularly Philip II, is able to make himself very, very powerful within Greece, I think he can, enemies of Greece can usually exploit that fragmentation that you talk about to for their own ends, and for their own, yes, in the Macedonian sense, their own imperialistic ends as well. So yes, which is perhaps one of the things that makes it so remarkable that within the invasions of Darius and Xerxes, that the Greeks managed to just about get enough unity. They were able just to be unfragmented for just long enough, to succeed in that defense.
Obviously, I think most of us have seen the movie 300, and where they give a fictionalized retelling of the Battle of Thermopylae. There, obviously, everyone knows this famous dialogue of "This is Sparta." Right? So, how did it happen that this small village moved from being a small village to a playing a really important role in the politics of Greece?
That's a really good question as well. I mean, it's like all these things. It took like the Persian Empire, but like on a much smaller scale. The Spartan state took longer to. It took a long time to grow. It was originally just a collection of small villages with Sparta, and which gradually came together, and then started to subdue local people. Within so again, Sparta is, if you ever get the chance to go there, it's an amazing location. Actually, it's on a flat plain with the sea at one end, and is surrounded by very, very high and steep mountains. It's a very enclosed area. So they were able to move and expand into their local territory, if you like. And there was a moment with Sparta where what they did. I mean, they had a government model on a completely different sort of a model to pretty much every other Greek state. And they, rather than having slaves like the Athenians and the Thebans and the Corinthians did, they had these people who they called helots, who were more like serfs. They are essentially a slave class, but each Spartan, who are a very small and narrow elite, has a helot who has a plot of land that person works in order to support the Spartan, who can then not have to do farming and trading and that kind of thing, but can train as a fighter, as a military fighter, and can become. What they did was that they trained like crazy, and they became. I mean, there's much in the 300 film that is quite accurate. There's much that's complete travesty as well, but in many ways, this military focus, this professionalism that the Spartans had, which was generated by the work of others, by the helots, by the time that they had that they could devote to that, enabled them to do that. And another thing I think that was crucial with Sparta is that there was a particular period in Greek history when many states sent out colonies to all over the place, to the Black Sea, to Italy, to Sicily, and so on, to sort of ease population pressures. The Spartans just went over the mountains and conquered the next area instead, an area called Messenia that was very fertile, and turned all the people there into helots as well, so that they were able to sort of produce this system in which they had a warrior elite who are like your 300, who train and fight and what have you, as almost like an aristocratic elite, supported by the sort of the body shattering labours of of this oppressed class of helots, but it enabled them to do something that other Greek states could not do, and interestingly, would not do as well, because the states of the Athenian type is that the people who fought as hoplites, the heavy-armed infantry soldiers, in Sparta, the state provided that kit. In Athens, you did. And this stuff is, you had to pay for it. So you had to provide your equipment, which is expensive, which meant that actually only a certain class were able to fight in that way. There were, quite an upper class within the society, really, and they regarded sort of manual work and training as almost like being a slave. We are amateurs. Spartans are professionals. We're amateurs, and it's the interesting ideological difference between the two, I think.
in both the battles of the Salamis and also in Thermopylae, what you say is the geography played a significant role. So would you say
Sorry, who played a significant role?
geography
Sorry.
played a significant role? So would you say, obviously, I mean, it seems that probably the strategic, uh, the battle strategy were developed by the generals obviously were, I mean, so probably the strategic understanding about battle by the generals was at a different level for the Greeks. So would you say that, I mean, why is it happened? And would you say that this, the quality of the general on the Greek side was at a higher level? What played this difference?
That's a good question. The I think the Greek generalship was pretty good. I think there, and the what they did very effectively, as you say, was to harness the geography and the local, not just the geography, the local weather conditions as well, and the sea conditions in a way that they knew so well. You know, this is their territory, and you know the people coming in, the invading Persians, which was this, you know, massive multiracial, multicultural um, army with people drawn from all over the Persian Empire who were unfamiliar with this kind of landscape. So the Greeks knew the territory that they were fighting on, you know, at first hand, and they knew that they could harness that really, really well and effectively. And again, there's good moments in Herodotus's history where there are dialogues, particularly Xerxes keeps getting advice and he keeps rejecting the advice. And I think that's one of the themes of the history. He's constantly being given good advice, sound advice by people on his own side who were saying, yeah, I'm really not sure about what you're doing here. You know, it's difficult to speak truth to power, but you know, we're not convinced by that. And he has an exiled Spartan king who's traveling with him, who keeps giving him advice as well. And the themes of what they say is look, the landscape, the weather, they're going to be against you, and also the Greeks fighting on their home territory, you know, and Xerxes never gets it. It's really interesting. He keeps giving this advice. He says, you know, how can they possibly resist me? I've got this massive army. I mean, I think in many ways he brings so many people that he feels he won't have to fight. The people just see this and say, "Oh no, we're not going to take you on." But the Spartan king Darius, who's, you know, the exiled king with him, he says, "No, I can guarantee you one thing: they will fight. You know, the democratic politics might be a mess and all this kind of thing. There might be disunity, but one of the things that they always obey is the law, and it's going to be freedom or death for them." So it's interesting. I think that we are certainly presented with this as, on the one hand, Xerxes and his commanders, particularly the high command, getting good advice from good sources and rejecting it with disastrous consequences. I think that's one of the themes of Herodotus's work. But also I think Leonidas at Thermopylae, even though he, you know, sort of fights a losing battle, you know, is part of a winning war in that respect. You know, he's able to harness the location and crucially create time for the rest of the other Greek defenders to get their act together. And likewise with Themistocles, he's brilliant. He's very tricky, but with the Salamis battle, he needs to get Xerxes to fight there and now, you know, and he's able to achieve that. despite the fact that again Xerxes is advised against that. So I think you've got to. There's a bit of credit and deficit, I think, but certainly the Greek defense is well coordinated with this excellent knowledge of local weather conditions and local geography, which is something that Xerxes doesn't know, and he doesn't understand his opponents either. And I think one of the nice pieces of recent research has been into the wind patterns that play around the island of Salamis, which combine perfectly to make life horrible for the Persian Navy when it goes into a narrow waterway again, which is what the Greeks wanted, and you get a certain wind pattern at one time of the day. Then it changes. You get another one. It almost like creates a pincer that creates havoc in the Persian fleet. And the Greeks who are fighting there, they're on those waters every day. They know exactly what's going to happen, so that they can harness those conditions as well. I think so. There's elements of that, I think, but broadly speaking, yeah, the Greeks do seem to be very well led and very well served by their commanders, both Spartan and Athenian, and others too.
So you have already also spoken about the incentives for Xerxes to attack or Darius to attack Greeks, right? And one story told about the wife asking to have the slaves from Greece, the other the revenge. So why is it that the Persian polity was always focused towards Greece and not more towards Asia, for instance?
That's a good question. I think again, it's a question of almost like it's kind of like they were pulled that way. Is that, I mean, the Darius and Xerxes' possessions within Asia were impressive, and a lot of them. Although Cyrus had been, the great King Cyrus had been killed fighting in the very eastern, the sort of northeastern parts of his domains. So maybe there was a reluctance to do that. We have, prior to the Greek invasions, also we have Darius and his Scythian expeditions. So where he goes, his idea is to essentially to cross into Europe, but then to go clockwise around the Black Sea, taking on the Scythians. So we don't really know what his goal was, but we have that sort of expedition, and the thing that works out with that is that he finds himself unable to get to grips with the Scythians. They're too mobile for him. There's these wonderful moments where his general, this is Darius with his generals, are saying, come on, guys, either surrender or fight us. One of the two. and the Scythians say, well, we're not going to do either. We don't have any cities. We're nomads. We just travel. And so in the end, Darius's forces end up in the middle of what's now the Ukraine, having not been able to come to any means of fighting against the Scythians, and then they withdraw. So I think that there's areas, he may have, had he been successful as he thought it done, he may have moved, further into, Asian territories, perhaps, in that particular campaign. But it's called that's called off, and then you have the Ionian Revolt that leads to the revenge conquest aspect of it too. So, and I suppose just one other thing is that the Persian Empire at that particular point of its development and expansion has been moving westwards and southwards rather than eastwards and northwards. You know what I mean? They've fairly recently conquered Egypt, for instance. So that was another aspect of that. So they've moved into to African territory and conquered Egypt. and what have you. So I think the focus was on, I think perhaps Western, moving Western, and they was like they got everything to the east that they wanted. And actually, there's and these things keep coming through, but there's, I think it's Xerxes who says that they start out seeking revenge on Greece, but you get this mission creep coming in. Well, if we capture Greece, we can just keep going. We go as far to the ocean, to the Atlantic Ocean, and Xerxes thinks, well, then that's it. That's the perfect moment. Then I've got, the sun will never set on my realm. It's from the rising to the setting sun. That's what I want.
Right. Talking about these three battles. So Battle of Thermopylae and Battle of Salamis happens in succession in same year, in fact in same month. But Battle of Marathon is after 10 years.
Yeah.
Right. So what was the significance of Battle of Marathon that also helped in saving the democracy at that point of time?
Yeah, I think so. Is that we have to, I think we have two kings really. I think is that so Darius sends his forces to punish the Athenians after the Great Revolt, the Ionian Revolt. The Athenians have helped in that revolt, and they've sent ships, and the temple at Sardis got burned. And there's again wonderful things of Darius fires an arrow into the sky, and he has one of his servants tell him every time he has a meal, he says, "Master, remember the Athenians." So he's coming to Greece, and he sends his forces to punish the two states who had sent ships to help the revolt, Eretria and Athens. Eretria is destroyed, so it's kind of 50% of the revenge is done. And then he moves into Athenian territory, and the Battle of Marathon is fought, which really unexpectedly the Athenians win. I don't think anyone was expecting the Athenians to win that battle. The Persian generals weren't, and in some ways, I don't think the Athenians were either. But they did. And after that, the Persians withdrew their forces. The revenge thing stayed very much on Darius's agenda, but then he had other things and started to make preparations for a much bigger expedition. But then he had other things that got in the way. Particularly, there was a big revolt in Egypt, and that was his priority. So that happened, and then he died. So he wasn't able to complete the project. He was then succeeded by Xerxes, and the transitions are always difficult. And Xerxes has this decision to make in many ways. Do I complete my parents' vengeance project or not? Do I let it go? And in the end, he decides to come. So that, I think, is why ultimately there's a sort of a 10-year gap between the two invasions. It's the first one is, if you like, 50% successful, but Athens is still on the agenda. And then essentially the Persian Empire has bigger fish to fry before Xerxes looks to put his massive expedition together to come back and fight at Thermopylae and Salamis and elsewhere.
So talking about the father-son duo, Darius I and Xerxes. So what are the difference between the personality that led into this battle?
That's interesting. I mean, Darius didn't lead his forces in person. So, he sends his generals to Datis and Artaphernes, his generals. So that's interesting in itself, I think. Xerxes is more hands-on, and he feels that he should accompany the expedition. And I think it is interesting how the two of them are portrayed. I think neither of them, from the Greek perspective, is a complete monster. But it's interesting that Xerxes seems to be the one who is, I think, perhaps more arrogant, more self-confident, more overconfident than Darius, and certainly the later Greek philosophers sort of feel this way, that Xerxes is a lesser kind of character than Darius. I'm not so sure whether that's the case. I mean, both of the two rulers were, within the context of the Persian Empire, very successful, very effective, very powerful. And these, you could see in a way these events on the fringes of their empire as being, just sort of minor distractions in a sense. Again, so it's interesting. I think is that, Darius, we know, we sort of have less about Darius in the Greek sources, but I think because he doesn't accompany the expedition, he directs it from his capital. It's interesting how he's characterized. Xerxes, though, is there all the time, and in Herodotus's account, not only is he there, but he's talking to people, talking to his own advisors, talking to Greeks. So in a way, we have a much more personal picture of Xerxes than we do of Darius. And we also have that, if you like, reinforced with Aeschylus's tragedy, The Persians, as well, where he dramatizes Darius's Xerxes' responses very effectively and very movingly. And what is interesting that in that particular tragedy, one of the great characters is the ghost of Darius, who appears to tell Xerxes what a great mess he's made of it. If you had your time again, Xerxes, don't invade Greece.
Sorry about that. Yeah. What projects are you currently working on?
Well, at the moment, all sorts of interesting things. I'm just knocking some ideas around about what to do next in terms of writing, and I think Alexander the Great is something that I'm quite interested in, as almost like as a follow-on from this. I've got wonderful teaching things lined up in Oxford for the forthcoming academic year, course on the Peloponnesian War. So just taking things from the Persian Wars onwards. I have online courses that you can all come and study with me at Oxford on a variety of things. Not this actually, but on Greek mythology, on the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, and the fall of the Roman Empire, which is good. And various travel things as well. I also do lecturing for some very nice travel companies. So I accompany their passengers and clients and give them information. So I will very shortly be setting sail with a company called Noble Caledonia to Sicily, south of Italy, and around Greece, and ending up in Athens, thinking about the Persian Wars, probably.
Thank you for joining us and discussing your book with us, and talking about the historic persons of all the battles and the state of affairs at that point of history. I really appreciate it, and wish you all the best for your endeavors. And we apologize for the inconvenience that you face because of the technical issues, and
Fine. Good. No, thank you very much. Thank you for having me. It's been very enjoyable. It's been lovely to meet you. And yes, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Namaste.
thank you.
Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.